I don't think most Americans or most Christians are Christian. I think they're liberals. I don't mean liberals in the political sense. I mean they've adopted this kind of utopian liberalism as their default religion, and it's just wearing Christian clothing. The Ayatollah recognized this. He understood this, and he understood that this was a massive threat to Islam. And so they actively rejected a lot of the trappings of this. And again, whatever you think of the Ayatollah, in many respects, he was a better steward of his people than our leaders have been.
Today's podcast is with a friend who has done some very interesting work and has some of our favorite takes on human dynamics. He joined us for this conversation under the condition of anonymity. Enjoy.
I'll just say you've done a lot of interesting things. We can start with that.
So my background, I did a lot of global behavioral work in the vaguest sense, right? I did some consulting for some major firms and governments, and we looked at behaviorism, right? Like there are lots of problems, whether you're talking about, sort of behavioral design and technology, but also like broad social problems. Like I even consulted on some natalist issues, right? Very, very slight stuff, all predicated on trying to understand human motivation, which is probably the area in social psychology that I regard as being the weakest. They have a very poor understanding. So we did a lot of consulting work for quite a few years. We did a lot of consulting work in this domain. We did a lot of research, and we did a lot of custom work, right? So we would be given a specific kind of behavioral problem, and we would try to model it out and figure out where we can optimize ideal behavioral outcomes. So this is a very general description, and I apologize for the vagueness, but I'm not interested in follow-up questions.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective, a lot of the stuff, like a theme that unifies a lot of stuff you've done is understanding how people work and what drives them to do that, and then what outcomes beyond the person itself those behaviors lead to. Because you might think, oh, that person is just acting on their own. Sort of the liberalism is like, that person's an independent unit. No. The way they behave and act leads to societal consequences.
Well, this is critical because you talk about what it is that what drives a person to act. And this sounds like a simple idea, right? It sounds like this, people are self-interested. Okay, but you don't know what your interests are. Your entire cognitive mechanics don't even work that way, right? It's often people are working off of a model that presumes transparency of your own mind. And we've talked about emotional systems a lot. This is a good way to understand human motivation. The critical purpose of your emotional systems is to make decisions. Because if you think about it, you go, well, what decision do you make right now? Okay, but you can do almost anything. You can drink coffee, you could say something, you could set yourself on fire, you could jump out the window, you could sit here and breathe. There's an almost infinite number of things you could do. So the level of complexity to just make a decision is absolutely astonishing. And so your emotional systems reduce that complexity, and they also direct your attention. So crazy, sketchy, methed out eye guy, walks by you, to pay attention to that guy. You get a sense of danger, a little bit of fear. Now you know where to look. Don't look at the floor. Don't look at the traffic. Look at that person. And then your emotional response reduces all of your possible decisions down to a small set of things. Run, fight, move across the street, whatever it happens to be. And so reducing complexity in order to help you make decisions. And this is a favorite example that I like to give, which is a very rare type of brain damage. And it only comes from external trauma. There's only a few hundred cases in history. And everything about your brain is fine, except it destroys your ability to make new emotions. And then there's a bunch of cool tests they give these people. And all they're trying to figure out is how long it takes for them to make decisions without the use of an emotional heuristic. So nothing to reduce complexity. Nice pronunciation there. They give them a red and one. My favorite one is they give them a red and a blue pen and a questionnaire. And all they're doing is timing how long it takes for them to decide which pen to pick. Now, you and I would do it in a fraction of a second. And the average amount of time it takes them, you want to guess?
5 seconds.
5 seconds is a ridiculous answer. That's an eternity to decide on a pen. The answer is 14 minutes.
Whoa.
And there's Spock, it's pure logic. I have to work through this. It is absolutely astonishing how much information you have to parse. And in order to make even the simplest of decisions. And that's really what's going on in your cognitive processes, right? And your consciousness can override the sort of set of decisional options you get given by your emotional systems because they're not always right. Like they can drive you off a cliff. But this gives you some sense as to how absolutely absurdly complex things are. Just everything you're dealing with. And I often use the example of like, well, what if you could see at the atomic level? You know how unbelievably difficult it would be to identify between, say, oxygen and a moving car, which is a pretty important distinction, right? So it's like managing complexity. And this, of course, goes to the question of anxiety. Like, what is anxiety? Well, when your emotional systems cannot successfully reduce complexity down to something useful, and it specifically has to do with mapping, but that's a different problem. When it can't do that, it sends up a specialized emotion. That's what anxiety is. It's, I cannot reduce this complexity down to something that I think will be helpful to you in solving your situation. Therefore, everything is scary. That's all anxiety does, is it makes everything, you afraid of everything because your brain is trying to avoid you dying. And last time I checked, there are an infinite number of ways to accidentally die and no way you can accidentally become immortal. So your brain has a bias towards not dying, which is, good. It's useful. And so this goes down into sort of human motivation. And what the social psychologist and the independent psychologists, all these guys try to do is they try to come up with these little sort of systems of human motivation. But really, what is going on with human motivation is reducing complexity, right? And specifically to do one of two things, to either utilize a map of known territory. So this is something you know how to do. Automatic behavior. Great. And I often use the example of a social heuristic of, from like the 70s, you go to a bar, you want to approach a girl. This is a very complicated thing. Like this is fraught with problems. You want to, a man approaching a strange woman, you shouldn't know you. You could be terrifying, but her giant homicidal boyfriend could be like just around the corner. Like you're walking into endless problems. So you go to the bartender and say, I want to buy that girl a drink. He's a safe intermediary. He approaches her, makes the offer. If she declines, you don't know why, it doesn't matter. Everything's safe. You move on with your life. She said, yes, you've now been invited to approach. And she's saying to you, I will talk to you for as long as it takes me to finish this drink. If you're interesting, she'll sip it. If you're terrible, she'll down it. And then that's it. About, $5 or whatever. So finding a map of known territory is extremely, is one of the things your brain likes to do. And if not, then it tries to generate maps of a new territory. And this is what your memory systems are mostly for. Like your memory is absolutely not reliable, right? It can be somewhat reliable, but it's not a photo. It's not a video recorder. That's not what your memory is for at all. It's for generating new maps of unknown territory, which is partly how your brain is bisected, right? Like, so partly it's for known territory, unknown territory. So your brain is trying to make maps that it thinks will help it navigate unknown territory. And so all of this goes into your sort of motivational decision making, like what motivates you to act. And it's far more complicated, but it's also far less obvious than you think it is, because a huge amount of what your brain is simply trying to do is to secure things. Like, okay, I've got this problem solved. I know how to do this. And now I have a new map that I can set in my brain and that will save me from danger in this area. And so like this is a huge amount of what you're actually doing. And it's not about, oh, I see value here, I'm going to pursue value. Well, why are you pursuing value? And then this, of course, is mitigated by things like your risk tolerance. And I talk about, sometimes we'll talk about this a little later. I talk about how like in women, for example, it's also true for men, but to a lesser extent, women's disgust response, for example, is regulated by sexual arousal. So one of the pitfalls of a man is you get a woman to a state of heightened sexual arousal, she's willing to do things she wouldn't have done 15 minutes ago. But now you have a problem. If you do that stuff and she wakes up the next morning and she regrets it, well, now that's a problem. Right. And
that's the perfect segue to Andrew Tate.
Well, and I will say this, like in a very real sense, that exact dynamic, in a very real sense, if a woman regrets sex with you, that is rape from her perspective. And from my perspective, well, I didn't use any violence or coercion. And we actually don't realize that they're both true. And we have to reconcile that. So the male definition of rape and the female definition of rape actually are very oppositional. And resolving that is a critical problem that we kind of just ignore. Like, that's probably not important, right? No, it's obviously really important. But as you said, the Tates are, I guess, back in America or about to be back in America.
I didn't realize they're American citizens.
Oh, I know very...
I saw some report that they said that's how they're coming back. Like, they're actually... turns out America is, which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
Fact check it, but wow.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't.
What do you make of them? Like, why are they a thing? Why are they this thing that just doesn't die?
So this is actually, I think this actually isn't that complicated. I think people are misunderstanding. Now, I'm not a big follower of the Tates. I'm not intimately aware of their stuff, but I had said a few years ago, maybe this is 8 or 9 years ago, to a friend of mine. And she laughed at me when I said this, which was I said, Return of the Kings, if you remember those guys, and the sort of pickup artist guys will be more influential in culture than libertarians or conservatives or even liberals. Mark my words. And she laughed at that which she should have. It's a ridiculous claim. But the reason I said it, and the reason I think, I'm tooting my own horn, I guess, but the reason I think it explains the Tates is very simple. What he offers is an unapologetic expression of masculinity, right? The problem with it is that particularly within Christian circles, the idea of masculinity has become very domestic. It serves the family. And then this is incorrect, right? The family has a purpose, and it is in its most fundamental sense. The purpose of a family is to make ambition durable, right? A man can go out, or a woman can go out and accomplish a bunch of things. They can acquire territory and assets. The family allows that to endure beyond their life. That's its function, right? Primarily. And when you relegate the man to the sort of domestic sphere, like everything you do serves the family, then the family is this sort of like weird end in and of itself. But it's not. It has a relationship to his ambition, or the marriage's shared ambition. Like, this is a critical idea. And a lot of guys feel as if, and this part of this comes from the 1950s. Post-World War II, we controlled 80% of the world's industrial capacity, okay? Which meant a lot of people suddenly got access to a level of wealth that they had never had before, and have, by the way, have spent the last 50 plus years trying to retain by stealing from their children. Whatever you want to condemn the boomers, you should, because they absolutely have spent their whole life trying to maintain that standard of living. They shifted from employment and all the way into like, oh, we're going to drive up housing prices because that was their primary asset. Really like stealing from their, but that's another problem. But the idea is that we shifted away from a lot of farm work and entrepreneurial work. And our regulatory structure encouraged this, and everyone became corporate workers. Well, you shifted from being a very small chieftain or a small king into a serf, a wealthy serf, but a serf all the same. And this was very domestic. And this model didn't hold up very long. But within a single generation, it was already breaking down. But we put it on TV, so everyone decided this was the norm. No, it isn't. It's a terrible model.
Right.
right? This domestic model is actually awful. Everybody hates it. Men and women both hate it. But this is the model that keeps being pushed. And the Tates say, no, don't do that. Conquer. Well, this is primal, but this is correct. A man's fundamental nature is to conquer. He has to conquer himself through discipline, and then he can go out and start to conquer territory. And what's being offered to people is, go get a degree and go be a serf. I would also hold all the risk of that. And also get married, and at any point, without judgment, she can take half your stuff. And so what Tate offers is, that's a fool's game. But what he offers, and this is my criticism of Tate, what he offers is very compelling because it's an unapologetic rejection of a life that, quite frankly, nobody really wants to live except the most timid. And of all of the two worst character attributes you can really have, other than things like sadism, are cowardice and timidity. And they're very related. And so he's offering you a way out of that, which of course makes it attractive. And he's not without his talent. He can be quite compelling, and he can be quite charismatic. I mean, he looks like a goblin, but he's a compelling guy, and he could probably beat the living hell out of me. So, I'm anonymous, buddy. Right? But this is what he offers. And there's not a really good counter offer. But to go back to what I was going to say, is my big criticism of what he offers is the life he offers is fundamentally dysgenic. Because what a man wants to do is you want to conquer. Now you have a little kingdom. It might be a little tiny small thing, but it is yours. And you will have a son or a daughter, somebody who will grow it. And that is then it will endure beyond you. And, you're like Pelago up in northern Spain. Today I'll conquer, I'll defy, and my great grandson will conquer, right? That's what you want to do. And in order to do that, the quality of your child morally, his cultural values, but also his genetic attributes have to be high. A big part of a marriage is improving your, the old fashioned way you'd say, improving your bloodline. Well, that still is relevant. And people do this. This is why women don't want to marry somebody with a lower degree than they have, because they're really just evaluating you by IQ, which is the dominant virtue in our culture today, which is why you can't, it's why you can't tell the truth about IQ. It's why you can't, you have to pretend that everyone's smart. Well, everyone can't be above average. Lots of people have to have a 90 IQ, but nobody ever says that. My favorite data point on this is that when you poll people, the average self-reported IQ is 114, which is a full standard deviation above the normal, but it's heavily weighted to above 100. No one says they have a 90 IQ, even though millions of people have to. Half the population is IQ below 100. No one says it. But anyway, the point is that that's partly what you're doing when you pick a spouse. You are finding, and I know sometimes this seems to be a Protestant quirk, but they try to interpret the word Azar as helper. First of all, this is an incorrect translation. There's not a perfect English translation, but it really means ally. It's how God describes himself in relation to Israel, for example, right? A wife is an ally. And you pick somebody who has traits that will help you accomplish your shared ambition. And maybe it's mostly yours and whatever. Maybe it's even mostly hers. But the point is you're the efficacious one. And she brings to the table a set of traits that are very critical. And some of those are genetic traits. And to get a high quality woman, you have to offer her a very specific kind of life. Well, Tate is going through volume, but the category of woman that he can get is not very high, and he's rich. For most guys trying to pursue that, the quality of woman will be even lower. And so what you end up with is a very dysgenic outcome, culturally, morally, and even genetically. It is very unlikely, certainly by the third generation, but it was very unlikely that the empire, if you want to call it that the Tates have built will be run successfully or grown successfully by his children. They'll probably run into the ground and spend all his money and become drug addicts or something like that. that's essentially the fundamental problem with what he's selling. The other aspect of it is a little more cultural criticism, which is you see this in a lot of poorer communities, which is the traditional model is this idea that you're supposed to go out. This would be like Jordan Peterson would argue this. Like, your job is to make yourself attractive to a wide range of women. Then you're supposed to keep one or pick one. And then you're supposed to, commit to her and provide and do all these things. Well, in some parts of the ghetto and other poorer cultures, it's the exact opposite. You would say a lion doesn't do that. It's like, I got a woman who pays my bill. She buys my clothes. She buys my food. That's a very ghetto kind of thing you'll hear. Guys are being like, she pays my bills. But an upper class guy who would value being a provider would find that sort of grotesque. But what happened is go back to the middle class idea from the 1950s, being a provider, because all of a sudden an average guy could be a very good provider in the 1950s was a point of pride. And we're still holding on to that. But that's not, you still have to provide for women, but you don't have to provide that. They won't starve without you. You have to provide something very different. And so what Tate has done is he has taken this idea and said, what a true king, a truly high status man extracts the most from a woman and gives the least. He provides as little as humanly possible, and that is the measure of his success. The most you can take from a woman and the least you give her is the measure of your success. And to be frank, that is a very attractive message, particularly if you're frustrated or hate women. But not even hate them. You just have to be frustrated with them, with their expectations and their demands and their desires. There's something about just having that authority over them. It's like, a woman is paying my rent. She's buying my clothes. She asks nothing of me because I'm a true king. Maybe you're right, but your son will be a loser.
Well, and that's the ideology of a 5-year-old child. Feel like everyone in this household serves me. Like, right. I get the most out of this relationship. Everything is provided for.
It's a cat.
Yeah.
Right? It's a child. It's exactly what it is. And because of the way he conducts himself, he will be able to have a certain measure of success. It's unlikely to endure. There will not be a Tate kingdom in 2 or 3 generations.
Right.
And if you're not trying to build something endurable, what are you doing?
Yeah, well, I think that's where it comes across this, maybe his own interpretation of what he's doing notwithstanding, like, it just comes across as hedonistic.
Right, but hedonism is like a criticism, and people go, well, what's wrong with hedonism? And to some extent, the answer of what's wrong with hedonism is that it extracts and it doesn't endure.
Sure.
And I mean, the ancient Greeks would die just for their name to be remembered, right? And some of them did some epic stuff, which is why we remember them. And you may scoff at that and say, well, that's not eternal life, right? Well, okay, maybe. But there's something to being remembered and being remembered fondly. But there's also something, if your impact on the world extends beyond not just your own life, maybe your own family. Like, there are men, you talk about Genghis Khan. Okay, sure, he left a genetic legacy. But can anyone name the capital of the Mongolian Empire? It was Karakorum. But what impact did he really have? Even Alexander the Great didn't have an enduring impact. His empires, collapsed almost immediately and fell into a bunch of little kingdoms. And some of them endured for a few hundred years, but that was their accomplishment, less his. And the great, whatever you can think of the British monarchy, it's ancient. It's 1,000 years old, right? Like, there are, and that's all really an aristocracy is, just the most successful families. And what everyone thinks of the English in their current condition, which is deplorable, obviously, that's an incredibly successful family.
So what do you make of Elon then with all his kids? He both has on the one, Tate doesn't have this. Elon has the he's building massive things, but on the flip side, when it comes to family life, he seems to behave a little bit like a Tate.
So Elon Musk has an explicitly eugenic sort of approach. You'll notice that all of the women he had children with were Jews, and all of them were smart. I mean, I don't know Ashley Sinclair, how bright she is, but there's a reason he seems to be almost ashamed of her. Like it was like a drunken mistake. He just got kind of like wrapped up in whatever it was, something. He doesn't seem proud of them. But you'll notice, he doesn't.
Yeah, there's a few of the women he's had kids with where he'll comment on their posts and be like,
yeah, he's proud of them.
Heart emoji or whatever. And there's others where he's like,
so
10-foot pole.
Elon Musk, I don't know the details of his family life, but I know this, that he has a number of sons, mostly sons, and they're involved. They spend time in his businesses. They learn there are expectations that they are going to be party to this. And he operates more like an actual king, right? He keeps these women in his life. He seems to be pretty actively engaged with his children to the best. I think maybe he wasn't before, but I think he is now. I can't be sure of that though. But he operates in a kind of like a proper king. Because he's applying this from, so like I say, he has a very eugenics approach to it. The reality is almost no one else can do that. You actually have like Tate can mimic that, but it's dysgenic because he's not at that level. If you're at that level, I mean, he's worth $500 billion almost. If you're at that level, you can do that, right? Mm-hmm. You can. You shouldn't, but you can. And there's a reason why kings have done that. And when you're building an empire the way he's building it, it kind of does need to endure beyond his life, which he seems to understand. He needs, for his goals to be accomplished, he needs to have sons or daughters who can inherit this. His empire, his businesses can't be destroyed. They can't be broken apart. He needs to raise a killer, and somebody who's a real apex predator, as one might say. And this speaks to the traditional dynamic. So the man's job is to conquer or to capture the throne. That's his fundamental role. And he'll do this and the other thing, which I'm about to mention, and then which is the woman's role, is to put her son on the throne. And so these are the two critical dynamics between men and women. Like the man's job is to conquer capture the throne. The woman's job is to ensure her son rules, right? And so, again, you're going to both do a little bit of that, but ensuring in order for this to play out, you have to have a kingdom that you've conquered, which means you can't be a serf, which is what so many people are. But then you also have to be party to that. You have to be party to raising your child, which we don't do anymore. We outsource it to public schools or even private schools. So we outsource them horribly. We outsource them to do what? To be serfs. Imagine taking and you see this, it doesn't matter how much money you make. You could be a high-end lawyer, you could be an NBA star, you're still a worker. You're still a serf. Imagine though being whatever, you own a plumbing business. You got 35 employees. You are a small king. Imagine sending your kid to be trained to be a serf and thinking that is a good idea, but also thinking that he's going to appreciate that. Thank you, Dad, for not giving me the chance, to build on what you built, but sending me off to go be a wage slave, as somebody might say, for somebody else. That's a kind of betrayal that our culture has absolutely not reckoned with. And again, because of the regulatory environment that makes being a self-employed or an entrepreneur so punitive, you understand why people don't do this. But imagine denying an entire generation the chance to be kings. And if there are no kings, there are no queens. And women hold a very specific kind of power, which is the power to destroy a civilization in a single generation if they choose to do so. And in countries like South Korea, they're doing it. And they're starting to do it in places all over the world. And
what that power being like
simply procreation.
Simply, yeah, not wanting to have kids.
Right.
Why do you put that onus on women in that, as you describe that?
Well, because if 95% of men decided not to have children, the human race could continue. But if 95% of women decided not to have children, show's over. Right? It's over. They have that power. And it's a critical power because if they hate you, they will destroy your civilization. And they are, because they do hate us. And that's actually something we have to contend with. Like, they really do hate us. And well, why do they hate us? Well, maybe it's because you're not kings. And which means they can never be queens. That's part of the issue. And we can go into this. It's complicated. But I generally point out that women don't want to have children. That's nonsense. Anybody who thinks that has not spent enough time around women. Women do not want to have children. They want to have a specific man's child. And you've heard me use this example, and I like it, which I always say. You go to a woman, you say, can you imagine a man that you would have children with? And she'll go, sure. How about 3 children? Maybe. How about 5? Not 5. 10? And they'll always go, 10. That's a joke. And I always go, okay. So if Tom Brady walked in and said, I want, and they always go, oh, Tom Brady. Of course. Because a woman's desire to have children is entirely predicated on her relationship to the man. Now, again, that's a little bit of an overstatement, but you also see this in a very dark sense with divorced women. Their willingness to allow, like, their future boyfriends and husbands are significantly more likely to abuse their children, often with the wife's knowledge. A divorced woman is significantly more likely to enable or allow another man to abuse the children because the child's not her child, it's yours. Now, she may not think that consciously unless she's an absolute monster, but deep in her psychology, she wants those children to be displaced and replaced by this man's child.
Because, I mean, in her new logic, this new man is higher, better.
Right. Well, also
more desirable than the previous man. That's why she left the previous guy.
Or the guy left her and she's been discarded, which speaks to another critical problem. Right? So one of the goals for men is to be worthy. We start without worthiness. We have to earn worthiness. This is why men have a rite of passage. You have to prove your merit. This is what the Joseph Campbellian heroes, the monomyth, the hero's journey was about. The hero's journey is a story of a man becoming competent. But a woman's situation is to become irreplaceable. And this is massively not understood by men today. Women are, in a great sense, fungible, right? You can treat a woman like she's just a glorified womb, like a breeder that you can just throw away when you're done with. That's her fundamental vulnerability. And so if you have to take that vulnerability away from her and make her irreplaceable. This is why beautiful women can often grow to hate their beauty, as anyone can hate their virtue if their virtue results in them being punished. If a woman's beauty attracts men whose primary purpose is to use her as a masturbatory object and then throw her away, she will grow to hate that beauty. Instead, the beauty is supposed to be an invitation for you to then discover her irreplaceability. And maybe to help develop that in her. If you make her irreplaceable, that's what you have. What a man today has to provide a woman is you have to provide a safe outlet for her ambition because she is less efficacious than a man. She's more sensitive, negative emotion. And you have to make her irreplaceable. If you do that, you will have a loyal woman. And any man who doesn't believe that is a fool. An absolute fool. You don't believe in the ride or die woman, you're a fool. Right? There are women, if you provide that for them, that woman will kill and die for you without question. There will be no man on this earth that can take her from you if you can provide that. But if you just treat her like a disposable sex object, she will grow to hate you and it. And that is largely what our culture, particularly in the expression of promiscuity, does. And you have to understand this, right? Men want to be worthy. And so women, in part, validate a man through sacrificial judgment. This is a critical idea. Aaron Rand and I talked about it. Always a guy worth listening. He's an interesting guy. The idea of a sacrificial judge is she confirms your merit, your worthiness, and that's what merit really means, worthiness. She confirms that by taking on a category of risk, often having children, but not always, that she would normally not do because she's risk averse, as women tend to be. And so through that sacrificial act, she confirms your worthiness. And this is, of course, one of the most important things a woman can do. That's why having children is so valuable in that regard. It confirms your worthiness. So that's what she can provide you. Now, but you have to reciprocate that by making her irreplaceable. And men are often failing to understand that that's not what they're doing. That's what they're not providing. Is they're not providing, like, oh, she's not going to starve without you, man. It's not 1930s. She's not going to starve without you. You have to make her irreplaceable, and then you have to provide cover for her ambition. And so, again, you go all the way back to the Tates, right? They ignore that, right? In part because that is a difficult and terrifying endeavor. But it also exposes you to a certain amount of risk, which is evidenced in divorce and in betrayal. And so there's a certain cowardice to the way they approach life, which is they're trying to mitigate their own risk. And this, of course, goes against the classical presentation of a hero. He always has his chest out. He's exposing himself to the world, which is the heroic visage, right? He's exposing himself to danger. Well, the Tates are like boxers, covered up, head, chin down, tucked in, hands up. Nothing's going to hurt me. It's a way to approach life. It's not a particularly noble way to approach life, and it's not a particularly admirable way. But if the alternative is what's being offered to you, which is a life of domestic servitude, I mean, who wouldn't pick that? And this is what a lot of the church leaders and a lot of the conservatives are running across, right? They're running afoul of this problem because they say what you will about Ayn Rand, but she understood the importance of heroic qualities. And she had this comment. There's a movie, I think it was called Alfie. I can't quite remember. It won Best Picture. And it's about a man, and he lives a very small life. I'm probably getting the name of the movie wrong. But she says in one of her essays, her essays are amazing and lovely. Her books are nigh unreadable. Sorry, Ayn Rand fans. She's unreadable garbage. I mean, brilliant stuff, but unreadable all the same. But she points out that you can look at James Bond, and yes, his actions are over the top, but there's admirable qualities because you want to be like James Bond. But in this movie, and it wasn't called Alfie, that's actually a different movie. But in this movie that she was referencing, you can appreciate him and like him and root for him, but you don't want to be like him. His victories are too small.
The protagonist.
Right. And that's right. And that is the fundamental appeal of Tate, is that his opponents are offering up victories that are too small. You have to offer men something bigger, right? Because they're men. Listen, if you give me the chance, I'll give you a choice. A stable $75,000 a year job, or a chance at $1 million, but it's only a 20% chance. And if you fail, you die. The number of men who would take that, probably most men, would be like 20% chance, $1 million a year. Not $1 million, $1 million a year. That's my career. Wouldn't even hesitate. They would do it instantly. And that's not what they're being offered. They're saying, take the safe, take the safe option. Well, that's actually a very feminine approach. So you're offering men a feminine approach. Okay, well, if I was 5'1" and 110 pounds, I take the safe approach too. But I'm not. Right.
For context, our guest is 7 foot and 300 pounds of pure muscle.
That's exactly right. Very impressive guy.
Yeah.
You've seen me tearing apart phone books, chewing on metal.
Yeah, that's right.
But this is it, right? So this is the appeal of what he's doing. But the problem is that it's dysgenic. I mean, you can make other criticisms. Obviously, there's religious criticisms, there's moral criticisms, but at a deep fundamental level, it's bloody dysgenic. And if there's anything you can do, like, listen, if Andrew Tate had children with Gina Carano, he's relatively athletic. She's athletic. They'd probably have impressive athletic kids. If he was having children with some smart woman, his father was a chess player. He's a good chess player, or at least he's a reasonably smart guy. His kids would be smarter, but he's not. So his children, he has betrayed his children and his bloodline by failing to improve it. Not just morally and culturally, but genetically. No. It's hard to imagine, again, we can I'm sure we can come up with some examples of a greater betrayal of your children than to not have procreated with the best person you possibly could.
Yeah.
It's like, it's an absolutely ludicrous thing to do to them.
So that kind of gets us to another thing I know you've been thinking about a lot recently, which is the Tate's aside, like just how to encourage more young people to get married, like find, young men to find high quality women and then get married. Tell us a little bit about that.
So
what do you see as the key drivers of the problem today?
Well, the problem is that what we tell men to do is go build your little kingdom, which is really more of a serfdom. So go build a life and then find a woman. So what that translates into is, I have accomplished something. I'm inviting you to serve a role in it. Well, for a woman of even the slightest bit of ambition, it's like, okay, I get to come in and be your breeder, and I get to be your housemaid, and I get to be your cook for a life. Why does she want a life of servitude? Right? What is that? So you often end up with people, especially the high performing men, with relatively poor options, even in only their late 20s and early 30s. The reality is that's the approach we've told men to take. And we also tell women to take a similar role. And part of this goes back to the problem of one of the worst things you can do in a relationship is compete. Don't compete with your spouse. It's an absolutely poisonous approach. But young men and young women today, starting from school, that's their fundamental relationship, is competition with men and competition with women. And this is why I always say schools should be gender segregated, but they should be right next door to one another. Because you still want men and women to interact, you just don't want them to compete directly.
Mm-hmm. And this men to compete with men and women. Yeah.
Right. And this is a key problem, because it also continues to get into the workforce. Like you're competing with the people you're supposed to be trying to pair off with, and that's not going to work. But you're also competing for resources to build a life. Like the number of women you meet in their late 20s who already own a home and are still single is very strange. But that's because they are competing with all resources with men. And they're also, and this is a problem. So if she has a set of ambitions and you have a set of ambitions, that if those ambitions are not exactly aligned, you're not going to work. Well, the later you get into your life, the harder that gets. What you want to do is you don't want to try to just slot a woman into your life at some point. It's a bad offer. And most ambitious women don't want that offer. That's a crappy offer. So we've taught men, here's what you do. So we want you to spend years of your life working to then go make a crappy offer to a woman. And also, if at any point she loses interest, she's going to take half your stuff.
Because you do have stuff at that point.
Right.
Right. It's a terrible
offer for both parties. But it also misses a critical point. Now, I will say this. If you took men and women and used some hypothetical example, they could live forever, and you separated them out and you went back to primitive times, in 1,000 years, men will have built a civilization, and in 1,000 years, women would still be living in caves. Right? And it's true because of the risk problem. But women can excel under conditions of safety and security that men can provide. So a huge amount of modern civilization has been doing things like mitigating violence and all of the other things that basically harm women. And now women can reach their potential. Well, they can do that within a marriage. And what a lot of guys today misunderstand is that a lot of women are very, very capable. And one thing that bothers me, you see this on the right, is this idea that somehow, like, what if you marry a woman who's smarter and a better judge than you? Should she be in charge? Well, the instinct is yes, but no, because temperamentally, that's one of the things that men do. They're temperamentally suited to, okay, what is it to be a leader? And the answer is it's the guy who puts his head in, in the noose. If the axe has to drop and he's got to lose his head, that's the accountable guy. Being a leader means being accountable. So what a woman does is she gives you authority over her as long as you take accountability with it. So you get these guys who are like, I'm in charge of the woman. And what I say goes. Okay, well, what if she's smart and capable or knows the situation better than you? Do you take her judgment or input? Well, the worst sexists are like, no, she's just a woman. Why would I listen to her? But listen, let's just say you're a 90 IQ guy. You're good looking, 90 IQ though. And you meet a woman and she's lots, 130 IQ, just really smart, really capable, comes from a good family, and for whatever reason you get the chance to marry her, you absolutely should. And you know what? She'll give you authority over her. But when you're trying to solve problems, you're still accountable. You're still the guy making the decision, but I'd be taking her advice more than anybody's. She's a capable, good decision maker because you make her safe by being accountable, right? Because it's the same. It goes back to the question, why can't a woman pick a restaurant? She knows where she wants to eat. What she's afraid of is, do we really want to spend the money? What if you don't like it? She doesn't want to be accountable for something going wrong. Because that's what women are fundamentally allergic to, is accountability, because the essence of accountability is death, and women are much more vulnerable in the world. So the man is taking accountability, and that protects her. And so if you're going and you're trying to pick a woman, you're going to pick a helper, which is, again, sort of what we're asking people to do. You build a life independent of a woman, and then try to get a helper to come in. You're not going to get the highest caliber of woman. But what you actually want to do is you want to get a high caliber woman early by making a completely different pitch to her. Instead of saying, this is the life I've built, come join it and be my helper, say to her, this is the life that we could reach, but only together. I could do a lot of things, but with you, I can do this other thing. Beyond what I could do with any other woman, but I need you to do it. And the reciprocal has to be true. Here's what you could do with me in your life. Mm-hmm. Now what you have is not a helper. You don't have a maid. You now have an ally. Yes, you still have to take the lead. You still have to be accountable. You still have to be the guy in charge. But now you've got a very capable person helping you. Now, I'll use an example. People scoff at Mackenzie Bezos. Okay. But we should point something out about this woman. She's a bright woman. She married this guy when he was younger. He wasn't a billionaire. She helped him get Amazon off the ground. She was part of that. No, she didn't run Amazon. She didn't contribute all that, but she helped get that thing off the ground. And she also gave him children. And then he betrayed her. Now, there might be perfectly good reasons, not to say they're good reasons, but the point is he ultimately betrayed her. So she got her payout, half of the stock. And quite frankly, that's hers. If you build $1 billion empire with your queen and then you betray her, payout, right? And to some extent, I suspect that the way she's giving away this money is out of spite, but I can't be sure. But this woman, was it the hottest woman, the sexiest woman?
The replacement?
No, I'm saying, Mackenzie, was she the hottest, sexiest? No, but she was an ally. And what he replaced her with was exactly what I always say is that when you look at the two of them together, him and Lauren Sanchez, it's obvious what he sees in her. Okay. And it's very simple. I know you guys laugh, but it's actually very simple. She makes him feel like king instead of king of the nerds. And I don't know the dynamic of his relationship with Mackenzie Bezos, but when a man leaves a woman, she's not even that attractive, but that's not the point. She doesn't have to be that attractive. She just has to make him feel like that. And it's worth anything. It was worth billions of dollars is what it was worth. And for whatever reason, Mackenzie Bezos was not able to do that or willing to do that. I don't know. And maybe there were other reasons. I'm obviously speculating. But the point I'm making is that's what you want to do if you think about a woman correctly. And if you understand what you're trying to do, because what happens is I go build a life. Okay, think about it like this. One of the least attractive things a woman can say to a man is, I want to have my fun before I get married. Who would want to marry that woman? Oh, you want to go have your fun and then I get what? So what marriage has become is a retirement home for fun, adventure, sex, all the things that are great. That's where it goes to die. Well, that's a terrible offer. But if you find a woman, if you look for a woman who's not a quote unquote helper, although some people that will be suitable for, but a woman who will be a critical partner in your ambition, who will let you do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. She has talents. She has, maybe even connections. She has resources. You can marry into money. There's lots of things. There are women who will provide that for you. And if you understand a woman like that, and you understand what you have to provide to keep her, then all of a sudden marriage gets a lot more attractive. And then there are other things, like if you talk to young people today, which is, hearing about young people's sexual experience today is horrible. Don't do it. They're terrible at it. I don't mean they're terrible about it morally, they are, but they're terrible at it technically. They're just really bad at sex. And you can get really good at it if you don't keep changing partners all the time. You can actually get astonishingly good. Like, I always love this. So I had a professor in college many years ago, and she was an absolute nut job. Complete weirdo, but she would point all these things. She's like, 7% of women have orgasms during childbirth. Orgasms are psychosomatic. Paraplegics have them in this muscle on the top of their sort of shoulder most commonly. You can do all kinds of crazy things sexually, but you have to do it basically with one person and over a very extended period of time. But what people do today is they keep changing partners. And so what they do is they develop a kind of set of behaviors they want to do sexually. And if those work with the partner you're with, you stay with them until you kind of get bored of them, but you never actually get good at it. You don't do anything with them because the sex is just masturbatory, right? You're just using another person as a masturbatory object. You're not really having any sex. There's no dance to it. There's no evolution to it. There's no intimacy to it. And so this is what they're doing, which is why it all dies after a marriage. But if you build a life with somebody from the beginning, saying, you and me together can do something amazing, and then you're invested in this person, and they're invested in your life, and they are sacrificing and grinding it out on your behalf, and every day you come home, and you've conquered a little bit on that day, and they see you, you come home with your knuckles bloodied, right? She bandages them up metaphorically. Like, I'll tell you this, the sex doesn't die in a relationship like that, right? You'll be one of those people in your 60s just like, going at it like rabbits. There are people like that. But you have to stay motivated. You have to stay in shape. You have to, and that's hard to do when you've just brought in this person into your life 10 years later than you should have. And now you're kind of a poor match a little bit because you don't align perfectly anymore. Because now they've got sexual baggage and psychological baggage. They also have a life that they've built independent of you. And they don't overlap necessarily perfectly. So there's lots of little frictions that pull away from the necessary psychological genesis of sexual arousal, which binds the marriage together. But if you're in the trenches with that woman, and she's critical to your success and vice versa, again, you come home with bloody knuckles and she bandages them up. Again, metaphorically speaking, that is the dynamic that keeps fire going.
Right.
And this is the way. And then the last thing I'll say about this, because I'm trying to get around to answering your question, which is this. When you hear an old man say to his old wife, "You're as beautiful as the day I first met you," we laugh at that. Oh, it's sweet, but it's obviously not true. Actually, that's not right. Because you can actually look at them, sort of the cognitive process going on there, and you'll see that when their visual systems activate, their memory systems will also activate. And what we think is going on there is that they're recalling memories of that person when they were younger. So yeah, he still looks at her and he sees her as an old woman, but he also sees her as the young woman. And so in a proper marriage, when you've invested yourself sexually in this person, there will be one person on this earth at least for whom you never age, you never get fat, you never get bald, you never die, right? There will actually be a person like that. She looks at you, she still sees a fit 20-year-old, and you still see a fit 20-year-old. Yeah, but you have to invest in that. And that's a way more attractive idea of marriage than the retirement home that we offer people. So how do I say to a 20-year-old, get married, retire, you're young, get into the institution you can think of, right? It's the way we talk about these things are absolutely wrong. But if instead you invest in somebody who makes you eternal, in a sense, eternally young, who also helps you achieve greater ambition than you could have ever achieved with anybody else, and who makes your ambition durable beyond your own life, well, that's a passionate romance. That's a marriage. That's something you want to find. What we offer people, the way we describe marriage, it's horrific. Go back to the Joseph Campbell idea of the hero's myth. He was asked what the female's hero's journey was, and he said there wasn't one because the woman was the prize at the end. And from the man's perspective, that's true. The hero's journey is a young man becomes competent, and the reward for being competent, he gets a woman. Now, it's different. Her version of the story is that competent men or aspiring men present themselves to her for her judgment, and she picks one. Then there's a third story on both sides. So there's really 6 stories instead of one. And there's a story of him as king and her as, or I should say, patriarch and matriarch. So king and queen. And those, but the story that's most poorly told in our culture is how you go from the first story to the third story. And that's marriage. Marriage is the domain of mastery. It's how you go from being a knight to a king.
Because a knight can be competent, virtuous, whatever.
But he's still a knight.
Right, he's just a knight.
Right? You want to become king, marriage gets you there. But no, we say marriage is a retirement home for everything fun in life. Well, of course, people aren't going to get married. That's a horrible... Why would anyone get married if that's what you offer them? But if instead you offer them what I've described, that's a far better option. And it's also a far better, a more compelling option for a high caliber woman. And it's also riskier to leave. Okay? You don't get thrown away if she's invested in a relationship like that because it's impossible to replace almost as you age. Because as you age, everything starts to narrow down. Your focuses, your talents, even your sexual proclivities, they get more and more specialized. And trying to find somebody who aligns with that perfectly, it's almost impossible. By the time you're 20, 27, 28, it gets difficult. By the time you're 32, it's effectively impossible. Right? 33, whatever the age that cutoff is, because you're now looking for a perfect match, and it gets harder every year you get older for men and women both. And so from a woman who's more sensitive to danger, if we correctly expressed the reality of the psychology and the biology, and for even the narrative elements, if we articulated that in our culture, through narrative mostly, then a woman would be sensitive to the risk of leaving a good marriage in that sense, even if she would be more likely to fight for it. And she'd be more likely to commit to it, to stay fit, to stay, invested in the relationship, stay healthy, whatever it happens to be, and vice versa. But we don't talk about marriage that way. And so, yeah, if you're just going into a kind of long-term dating situation where there's a catch out at the end, yeah, of course men are going to be suspicious of women under those conditions and not want to do it. And then, of course, there's also just basic things like hedonism, where it's like, yeah, I could have my fun, and then I can get the good girl. No. The best women are not going to marry you when you're 35 and run through, because men get run through too. This problem of how we talk about marriage is absolutely poisonous. But if you look in the elites, again, it's poor people who need this the most, who are getting demolished by it. They're the ones who aren't getting married.
Right.
But if you look at elites, they get married younger. I'm not saying you get married when you're 18, but they're getting married younger, and they're more likely to stay married.
Fertility rate is higher, everything like that.
Exactly. And they're also much more likely to pursue ambition in the manner in which I've described. And this is just, we've just obliterated this idea of the marriage being an opportunity to improve your cultural, moral, and genetic bloodline, or at least your legacy, but also as the optimal vehicle to achieving ambition. We just obliterated that proper understanding of it. And you end up with a very unattractive institution. And then we wonder why guys won't do it.
Yeah.
And why women won't do it. Oh, what a shock.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
There's a sense in the online right that, you mentioned this briefly, that women can be run through, but that men are somehow impervious to that.
Yeah, this is idiotic and also terribly unscientific. I mean, I hate to say it that harshly, but I understand the rationalization of this, but what happens is different, right? So for women, everyone's seen the pair bonding literature. I mean, I doubt anybody reads it, but if you want some awfully dark scientific literature, read that. Like that and IQ research are two of the darkest, because what it shows very clearly is that every sexual partner a woman has diminishes her capacity to pair bond, which is effective to building a trusting dynamic. It just gets harder and harder and harder. That's not exactly what happens to men, right? To understand what happens to men is a little different. So women are more flexible fundamentally than men. They're a little more pliable, which is why, you talk about the war bride idea or whatever. For a million different reasons, literally, physically, and also psychologically, they're more flexible. They tend to bounce back. Men are a bit more brittle. We're a little bit more powerful, but we're a little bit more brittle. And here's what happens to men. And I'm going to briefly discuss homosexuality, which will make you guys laugh because you guys have heard this, which is this. There's this idea that male homosexuality and female homosexuality are the same, are kind of like sort of the same. They're not. They're very different animals. But male homosexuality in particular is not an attraction to men. It's a fetish for transgression, right? It's not what people think it is. And that's why you get, and I won't go into it, but that's why you get so many weird, depraved behaviors. But it's also why the more homosexuality, I learned this from a gay guy. It was interesting. He was telling me this. He was one of the old guard. He was one of the old guard who was opposed to the normalization of homosexuality in culture. And he said, you don't understand this. And we get off on the transgression. And if you normalize being gay, we're going to have to do creepier, weirder stuff to get off. He's like, and we don't necessarily want to do that. We like what we're doing. And we like that it grosses everyone else out and offends them. And you rarely hear it spoken like that, but that's the reality of it. But it's a fetish for transgression, mostly. Now, this speaks to the way male sexual behavior works, which is there is no such thing as homosexuality or heterosexuality. What you have is a sexual impulse that will be narrowed over time. And the choices you make will narrow it. You watch a bunch of porn, that narrows it. You're promiscuous, that narrows it. And little by little by little, now, if you're with one person, your sexuality gets reduced down to the level of a single individual. If you've done it right, you're not attracted to women anymore. You're literally just attracted to that one woman. Like, it'll be like, she can just smile at you and you're like, I'm ready to go, right? That's it. Now, what happens with men who are promiscuous is that their sexuality gets increasingly narrowed in a manner that is not satisfiable by a single person. And so they become increasingly impossible to match. Whereas the woman will struggle to pair bond, the man becomes impossible to satisfy. And the two primary male vices are violence and sexual degeneracy. And this becomes, you see this with fetishization. The older a man gets, the more likely he is to start to fetishize behaviors. But if you're a promiscuous man, by the time you get into your 40s or whatever, you start to have such precise sexual needs, and you see this in things like the BDSM community, that it becomes almost impossible for anyone to satisfy. And so you just become, I'm sorry, but a 40-year-old man who's been promiscuous for his adult life,
total creep.
Yeah. He's almost certainly going to be kind of a sexual degenerate.
Right.
And it's almost impossible for him to be in a functional relationship in any sense. And guys who don't think women can smell that on you are absolutely out of their minds. All you have to do is talk to a woman. They will, if you can get them to talk to you, they will tell you this. But you can absolutely see it. And by the way, they don't just tell you, they absolutely ridicule you to other women. They sit around and you're the 40-year-old guy who goes to the club. Yeah, they know what you are and they're repulsed by you. And then there'll be guys who say, oh no, you can spend your 20s and 30s having sex and making money. And then when you're 40, you can marry. Let me explain this to you very quickly. Simple. If you're 35, you can definitely date a 25-year-old. But only because you have more money and sophistication than the 25-year-old peers. She doesn't want to marry you. She doesn't want to have your children. She might marry, but she doesn't want to have your children. You just have more resources for her. So she's wasting your time the way men often waste women's 30s, or their 20s with promises of marriage. You're a sucker. When you see a 35-year-old dating a 25-year-old, it's like, dude, you're an ATM for her. You can afford to take her to Paris because you have a good job. You're an idiot. That guy is an idiot. But they think this, but the reality is women know it. And so the women these men attract, because again, women know they're a creep. So the category of woman who will date and or marry him at that point is often very predatory or very low character, which is why they're so likely to get screwed at a divorce. Mm-hmm. Because they can't, all the good women are like, whoa, no, stay away from this guy.
Yeah, Paul, I was just reading I think it was a section from an old interview, maybe it's a recent interview, but Palmer Luckey was talking about, he had this section in this interview about railing against optionality, like the modern world's obsession with optionality. And he was specifically, what's fun about this section is he specifically talks about it in the context of marriage. He said, I married my wife when I had, I think he says $400 or $600 in my account. Like I was nobody, had nothing. Now he's, worth a few billion. But he's like, I married my wife when I had $600 to my name. I had nothing. But I went all in, and we went all in on this together. She's talking about this as opposed to just sort of creating, either optionality or waiting till later in life where you bring her along by the time he's worth, right, a few billion. And then that's just a fundamentally different, the math is just a fundamentally different.
How do you ever trust a woman if you brought her in when you were already a billionaire?
Right.
It's like beautiful people never know who their friends are. Rich people never know who their friends are.
Right.
You don't want to date while rich. That sucks. You do not get married when you're rich. Get married when you're poor, right? Yes. And ambitious and talented. But he's right. Remember I mentioned earlier, a huge part of your cognitive processes are about reducing complexity, optionality. Reducing optionality is incredibly important in your life. You want to find where you live. You want to find your job. You can't do everything. And if you can't do everything, if you try to do everything, you can't do anything. Right. So reduce optionality, right? And so this is a huge amount of his success. I don't know how much can be attributed directly to her. I don't know. What I can tell you is he's probably a happy man. They probably have a good marriage, right? Because he found a woman that he relied on her when he was struggling. She helped him. And he knows that she can trust him. Yeah. He knows that because she was the sacrificial judge. She gambled on him. If he turned out to be a loser, she's stuck with a loser. And I've talked about this, which is the issue of abortion. I know it's a hard pivot, but abortion has nothing to do with rape or incest. No. The fear that women have of rape not rape, sorry, of abortion is fundamentally rooted, around the issue of abortion is rooted in being forced to carry an inferior man's child. That's the woman's worst nightmare, fundamentally. And if she's a woman who's stuck with a loser, she's taking a real gamble when she does that. When she marries, he must have had real pull. He must have been charismatic. He must have been something when he was a younger guy. He got a woman to marry her when he had nothing. But now he knows he can trust her without question. Yeah. Right? He's got somebody, and
he won the game. Right.
And he's built a life. It's like, sure, could he quote unquote bang some hotter chick? I don't know what his wife looks like. I've never met her. It's like, yeah, he probably could. But why would you reduce yourself to an ATM and a masturbatory object? Why would you do that to yourself? You have to hate yourself to do that. Like, you want to come home to the woman. Yeah, maybe she's, not the prettiest woman in the world, but you want to, whatever the thing is that people are crudely concerned with, you want to come home to a woman who truly sees you as the best of what you could be. And you can only get that if you marry before you are that. Because if she doesn't marry you for your potential, how committed is she really? Right? So you want to be able to come home to that, because now you've reduced optionality for yourself in a critical way. You've secured this. You know that this is real. You've got a few things in your life are real. Why would you take that from yourself? What type of idiot takes that away? For what?
Yeah. What's going on temperamentally with men and women? I think in the most extreme case, like the top chess players, all guys, which in like our current like liberal environment, you would say, hey, this is like a purely meritocratic field. It's a game. Like this should be a mix. Like what's happening there?
Well, so it's a little bit of a myth that the top women are all, sleeping with the top guys. Mm-hmm. This myth largely came from data. I think the first people who released this was OkCupid, right? Which is a very specific demographic. And it's all basically comes from dating, websites, right? It's essentially where it comes from. And these findings have been overstated. What's actually happening is that you have a category of promiscuous people. Most people are serial monogamists. They date for a year to 2 years, and they just do it consistently. They don't have 50 sexual partners. Every girl you meet isn't banging the stud in the bar. Okay. It's not happening. What they're actually doing is they're engaging in serial relationships. There's always some brief trends of certain things that go on, but like hookup culture is, again, they're always a little bit overstated. But that's really what's going on. The real problem, where the breakdown is in social competence, and this becomes critical for a key reason. Women are generally a little bit more socially competent than men. And so when things like social media come around and really undermine people's social competence, men suffer worse. And again, women are heavily risk averse on average. And so one of the things they're constantly evaluating is, they're using heuristics to evaluate your competence across multiple domains. And one of those is social competence. So socially incompetent men just churn off women instantly. And so they'll clamor to, or they'll at least want to be around a small category of socially capable men. And a lot of guys don't really understand. This is a skill. Now listen, I'm about as charismatic as cancer, okay? And I am not famously charming, but I can literally go talk to almost any woman on the street. I can talk abstract conversation and have it be a friendly, engaging, charming conversation. No problem. It's not difficult, but I'm old, right? But I've been like this since I wasn't old because I have social competence. So I know how to be charming. But this skill isn't particularly well developed. And so here is the fundamental problem, how it's working psychologically. See, when a man rejects a woman, that's that guy rejecting that woman. It's very personal. When a woman rejects a man, it's the absolute definitive judgment of nature itself. She's saying, you are the worst of your breed. You should not continue. A rejection from a woman is brutal, which is why the social rule used to be men will take the risk of that devastating rejection, but women will be nice about it. But men will accept their judgment. And that's the rule. And that's all kind of fallen apart. So the sense of rejection that men get is absolutely brutal. And we don't teach them how to handle it because we don't teach them what it means. And we don't teach them why it happens. The reality is that, again, women are vulnerable and their fundamental orientation is to try to mitigate that, in order to ensure some type of concrete, stable ground. And if you give a woman any indication that you're unreliable or incompetent, she's out. And so you have this whole generation of men who are just absolutely incompetent at basic social dynamics. Everything down to the sexual mechanics, to just having a basic conversation. They're not very capable, so they don't instill faith in a woman. But then there's the other issue, which is that they don't understand what a woman is. So what they're doing, going back to what I said earlier, they are seeking her. Like when you see a beautiful woman, the average man, when he approaches her, everything he communicates to her is, I would like to ejaculate inside of you. So her beauty has elicited that response. She's not stupid. She knows what you mean. And that's what you mean. And the problem is that's what you mean. Okay? Yes, you can obscure that with dishonesty, but you also have to actually develop your understanding of what a woman is. Yes, women can be capricious and volatile and fickle and difficult. They're women. Surprise, right? They are what they are. But they can also be incredibly life-affirming. They can be supportive, and they can be, man, you see a woman like fight to be by your side. Man, that's a thing of beauty, right? Like you see a woman just dismiss like another like high. Like I actually knew a guy. It's very funny. He was an engineer at Boeing. And he married this woman who was 2 inches, she was 5'11", 2 inches taller than him and just absolutely massively athletic. And he was kind of a not. And he's like, kids are either going to be killers or brains, hopefully both. And she wasn't the prettiest girl, and she carried a little bit of extra weight on her, but she was very athletic, like very, very physically capable. And she was enamored with him because she's like, I'm not going to get a guy like this. And then she actually got much prettier as she got a little older, into her late 20s. She got very, very pretty. And so she started getting attention from lots and lots of people. And it made no difference. She laughed. I mean, and the story is that I can't remember who it was, but it was one of those early 2000s tech like multimillionaires in Seattle. It was at like a conference, and he was like really aggressively hitting on her. And she just laughed at him. She's like, that's my husband. And in the same event, she got hit on by an NFL player and did the same thing. She laughed. And the story came down to me from an observer who said, from the NFL player, he said, and I quote, this is the quote that I got. He said, who the fuck is her husband? Like, he didn't see him. He was just like, and he just went on. He was the NFL player. He didn't care. He took the rejection, went on with his day, laughed it off. But he was just like, damn. Like, and it didn't matter who he really was, but that's
he was saying he's a better man than you.
That's who she was. That's who he was to her.
Right.
And that's a powerful thing. But if you understand what you can get out of a great woman, then you start to treat them differently. But a huge part of the issue is that they don't know how to do that. And then you have this other problem, which is people are increasingly very sort of emotionally unsophisticated. And so their emotional systems haven't differentiated. And so you ask this basic question, like, why do girls like bad boys? And the answer is they don't. What's actually happening is that their emotional systems haven't differentiated, so they're overlapping terror and excitement as the same thing. They're conflating them as the same thing, because as you age, your emotional systems differentiate and you get basically more emotions. And if you haven't seen it, there's actually it's rare for me to recommend a movie, but Inside Out, it's a Pixar movie, is one of the best movies I've ever seen. And it will probably save people's lives. And it shows this differentiation of emotions really well. And it also shows, like, there's a really beautiful moment in the film, spoilers, which is the end of it is children are dominated by joy as an emotion. As you age, joy recedes. It's less and less a dominant emotion. And in the story, they didn't know what the purpose of sadness was. That was part of the critical plot point. And what you learn is that the purpose of sadness is to indicate to other people that you need help, right? So it's a really, and if you're a kid, that's a really powerful idea. But the point is that your emotional systems differentiate. And so young women, especially, or unsophisticated women, they're basically cognitively mistaking terror from the bad boy, because he's usually capricious and volatile. So she's mistaking being terrorized for being excited. Sure. And so that's often what's going on. And then you have this level of sophistication that around what I'll call deceit, because what our culture rewards today is fraud. That's all a pickup artist is, right? A pickup artist is just somebody who is able to mimic being attractive under certain conditions long enough to get you to sleep with them. They don't care if you discover who they are the next day. They succeeded. The worst guys are guys who can trick you into a relationship that takes up 2-3 years of your life before you, or more longer, before they find out that you're terrible. Or a woman who'll do the same thing. So our culture rewards fraud, and you go online and, good Lord, dating now with every you can't trust a single picture any woman has ever put online. You can't. It's that's definitely an illusion. So the culture rewards fraud, and so people get really good at exploiting that, because that's a critical skill. If that's what the culture rewards, get good at it. So now you have a bunch of socially incompetent men, and then you have a bunch of, I'll call it the hacker ethos, a bunch of very capable exploiters. And those guys are the ones being the most successful with women and doing the most damage, because they have refined the skill. Now, they have a hacker ethos, which is identify a vulnerability and exploit it, which is a terrible thing to do to a woman, but that's what they're doing. And so it isn't that women are just sleeping, all the women, every 5 is sleeping with a 10 on an off night for him. That's not what's happening. What's happening is they're getting in monogamous relationships with guys who treat them poorly over a long period of time by exploiting their vulnerabilities. They manipulate them, they jerk them around, they gaslight them, they betray them, they do all these things, and now they discard them, and then that woman hits the market, and now she's available to you. And so you have a damaged woman and a bitterly rejected man who's frustrated, going, why would you date this manipulative loser? Oh, you just like that. No, it's that her defensive systems are unrefined, especially when she's young, and his offensive systems are very good. Right? You're going to condemn her for that? She got worked over. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, obviously, she bears some of the responsibility for that, but this goes back to why I talk about this a lot, actually, with anyone I know who's a parent, which is the critical skill you have to teach every teenager by the time they are 14 or 15, but especially girls, is how to identify pathological psychology in the opposite sex and how to identify trending exploits. What are the techniques that are used to exploit you that are common today or emerging? You have to teach them how to use that. And so that's not being taught by anybody. Nobody teaches that. So you're sending women, and then we do this other thing, right? Which is historically you grow up in a town. There's only a few dozen, maybe a few hundred people in your age range. So you know who the good families are. You know who the smart and the bad kids are. You know all this. By the time you reach your point where you're starting to engage sexually, you've narrowed it down to a very small number of people that are in your league, so to speak. and then you can pick one of them. But what we do is in that exact moment, we take you out of that town where you've spent, 15 to 18, whatever years learning all this information, and we deposit you into a completely new town with thousands of other people just like you. You are absolutely ripe to be taken advantage of. And it is insanely irresponsible that no one is teaching children how to defend themselves. And the men have no sympathy, probably because they don't understand what's happening to them. They think the women just like bad boys. They like being abused. Okay, don't be an idiot. Also, listen, if you meet a woman who likes being abused, she's definitely over 40, right? There's a category of them, but it takes a lot of depravity to get there. The hard reality of this is that women are engaging in bad behavior because they're not being taught proper defensive techniques to avoid it. And men have failed to appreciate a very simple reality, which is women are more agreeable than men. And domains that women excel in, like women overperform their IQs, for example, in school, because school rewards three things. It rewards diligence. Men and women are equal there. Rewards IQ. Outside of the extreme outliers, men and women are equal there. But it also rewards obedience. And women are more agreeable. So they're more obedient than men, right? Men overperform their IQs in domains where risk tolerance is critical, like trying to get published, for example, or, starting a business. And these are both valuable things, but they also have a drawback. But the point is that women are more susceptible to public pressure, to peer pressure, to manipulation than men are. They are more vulnerable. And we are sending them out into a world of sharks completely unprepared for that. And then the men who don't get to take advantage of them. And this is what bothers me is you go, okay, you just saw a woman get used and discarded like trash. Is your concern that she was used and discarded like trash, or is it your concern that you didn't get to do that? Right? And a lot of these guys will say, well, I would have married her and treated her right. No, you wouldn't. Okay. It's like the idea of like the nerdy guy. They would treat women right. No, they won't. You ever met a nerd? Nerds aren't harmless, good people. Are you kidding me? Like, ruled by nerds, like the worst. They're like look at all those trans creeps and weirdos in like the NSA. And why do you think the trans stuff is all huge in all the tech companies? Nerds are degenerates mostly. They're socially incompetent weirdos. Right? That's why they get sort of pushed into a little corner. It's like
it's Tumblr.
Yeah. Right. It's exactly. The socially incompetent people who degenerate in nerddom aren't going to suddenly treat women well. Right? It's like that's ludicrous. If you embody virtue, not mimic it, but if you embody it, you will find your ride or die woman. You don't have to be attractive. You don't even have to be that smart. No. Right? You can do that. But if you're going to sit here and complain because because other people were slightly worse than you, suck it up, loser. It's like, oh, I wish I could have slept with a dozen women. Well, you know what? I'm interested in helping you idiots. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, don't be that guy.
So we talked a lot about men and women. Shifting gears to another key kind of theme going on today, maybe more the geopolitical stage. What's going on with Europe? What do you think there? and I think I've heard you talk about in the past. In Europe specifically, there's this dynamic of rising takeover by Islam.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk about what happened to Europe, and then why is Islam sort of what should we expect from an Islamic force takeover?
Well, so there's a nice little pivot here.
Okay, sure.
So the central appeal of Islam is I've talked about how much the rejection of women like affects, and all of this stuff, right? The central appeal of Islam is that it gives every man authority over virtually every woman. Instead of authority over one woman or a small collection of women, if you have like daughters and things like that, it gives you power over women. And this is for men, this is a particularly loser men, of which there's always a significant number, this is a very attractive thing, right? And this is incredible. We'll set aside all of the unbelievable metaphysical problems and moral problems with Islam, like different questions, right? These are things we can criticize, all kinds of issues. But the hard reality is that from a cultural perspective, that's the critical appeal of Islam, is it gives you domain authority over women as a group. Well, if you're women, you're not just now suddenly subject to men, you're subject to the worst men, which is an absolute nightmare. But you have to go, well, why is this happening? Well, part of the issue is that Europe is old. And old people, like, they're so proud of their low crime. I got news for you. They didn't have some cultural, like, grand cultural achievement of, like, solving crime. When I was a young man, you couldn't go to Italy without hiding your goods, on your body because of pickpockets. There was plenty of violence in France and England. England was notorious. They had plenty of street violence in England. And the Irish have notorious. No, what actually happened was they got old. Right? That's it. And old populations lack dynamism in a number of ways, but they also struggle to resist because they can't. They can't resist aggression. And Islam is not particularly, the cultures Islam is coming from particularly, these are not high-functioning cultures mostly. They are struggling, but they have young dynamism, and young dynamism will overwhelm weak old people very easily. And so you look at Europe today, and basically you have, we'll start with just very briefly with World War I. In 1900, roughly speaking, if you want to use the term white people, although race is a very dubious concept, right? Like it's you have ethnic groups that emerge, all those things, but race itself is sort of a poor concept. Not totally without value, but it's not a very good concept. But if you want to say white people, they were roughly 34% of the global population. And they had dominion over almost anywhere that there was space to grow. Today, they're about 7% and it's declining. And they are significantly diminished. And they no longer have dominion over any single nation, unless you want to count Iceland, which only has, I think, 250,000 people in it. This is quite a collapse. This is probably the most significant collapse of any civilization in human history. And it happened unbelievably quickly, and it happened for two reasons. One was 2 world wars that absolutely just obliterated. Like, for example, Russia had about 135 million people in 1900. It has about 135 million today, too. So it hasn't grown at all. That's what you get for losing millions of people in wars, and then also communism. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, had 90 million people approximately in 1900. Today has 1.4 billion. India had just shy of about 300 million. No, that's not true. It's about 250 million in 1900. Today is 1.4 billion. This is an astonishing transformation.
And it's totally asymmetric too.
Yeah.
Between those two regions.
Just absolutely astonishing. And then you had birth control. And what this did was essentially you had a massive dysgenic effect. You sent your best and brightest to die in wars. You stretched the length of a generation by delaying childbirth. And then, you got it's changing a little bit, but yeah, as richer people, but for a while, for about 2 generations, rich people weren't having any kids. And so you had a massive dysgenic effect. And frankly, a big part of what happened in Europe was they basically just obliterated the quality of their people. And now you're left with, I've mentioned this, if you took out an Englishman in 1900, just from a purely genetic perspective, you were probably looking at one of the finest human beings that the world has ever created. They were an absolute marvel of productivity, of character, unbelievable human beings, what they achieved. Today, they're garbage people. The English are just absolutely just garbage people. It's a useless country. Quite frankly, the whole thing we should invade the whole thing just to spare them the indignity of being conquered by Islam. right? It's like absolutely, but we should probably deport all those people. It's ours now. You don't belong here anymore. You're embarrassment. They're absolutely despicable, and they're known to be grotesque. The rest of Europe ridicules them. They're drunken idiots. They're ugly. They're just awful. And everyone knows it. And they're still acting like they're the British Empire. It's like, sorry, you're not Rudyard Kipling, okay? Like, they're terrible. But this happened across all of Europe, right? And they are just genetically just obliterated. But then there's another factor, and this factor has to do with the idea of what I'll call global liberal egalitarianism. So the idea of like the parliamentary republics, for example, that dominate the globe is the most popular form of government. And then the egalitarianism that was pushed by the English and then later by the United States. Every single country you've deposited this form of government and sort of cultural element into, every single one has resulted in their decline. It's astonishing to say this, but I know it's like trendy in some parts of the right to like defend the Nazis. Listen, the Nazis were absolutely horrific. Philosophically, if you understand what they were actually like philosophically, they were just an absolute ludicrous, like ridiculous people. And Hitler was no angel. Like these aren't good people. But if you just said, imagine for a moment that we had somehow managed to avoid a devastating existential war. And historically, wars were not existential, but the 20th century created every war was all or nothing, which is what Europe wants with the Ukraine now. It's like, you know what? You used to have diplomacy, and yeah, you might lose some territory, but you didn't send an entire generation to die.
Right. You're betting your entire...
Yeah, England sent 10% of its population, its best people, and 25% of its GDP because Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia. Over a piece of paper, that they sacrificed all of that. And the reason they did that was basically because they were essentially not really Christian anymore. They were their liberalism was like their new religion, and they were essentially trying to immanentize the eschaton, as they say. Like they were trying to make the world into a paradise, and in their mind, that was making everyone British. So they exported their government everywhere. But we don't really talk about it like that. But that's what it was. But anyway, the idea here is that they absolutely everyone just got obliterated, right? You send your best and your brightest, you do all this, and now you have this absolutely just gutted population. Well, then you have this liberal global politics, this egalitarianism, which was very susceptible to, like Horkheimer and the critical theorists. They presented that they identified a critical vulnerability in this form of government, this freedom, right? The vulnerability was that you could erode its confidence by relentless criticism, even if the criticism was unfounded. So they identified a critical vulnerability in liberal societies, and liberal societies just could not respond to this. So it has a critical weakness everywhere, which is why you go to Europe today and you hear the same rhetoric that made sense in America, where you might hear like a black person say, black people built America. Whether you think it's true or not is irrelevant. But then you'll hear like black people in England saying, black people built England. It's like, what are you talking about? It's because
clearly, obviously,
right. But the same argument works there, even though it was an American argument that worked here, because the same vulnerabilities exist. So liberal societies had this vulnerability, and
funny. I'll just make a quick comment there. A convoluted story. One of my grandpas is from Texas. I grew up in Mexico City, made my way to the U.S. But I remember seeing wokeness, but really liberalism, lagging 5 years behind and my friends in Mexico through like Facebook and stuff, keeping in touch with them. So stuff that would be seen or said here, whenever critical race theory, patriarchy, all these terms that didn't really exist, like nobody used them down there. 5 years later, right, they would emerge, and they made no sense. But all of a sudden they took kind of the same thing.
And a lot of this was financed by USA.
Yeah, right? Of course. But like all of a sudden, like Mexico doesn't have this like racial tension the way that it exists in the US. All of a sudden, though, that racial language, it becomes a thing.
And this is because liberal societies, the form of government that the British and America spread across the globe, right? And after the World Wars, we essentially have been Europe is old and poor. Like England is about as rich as Mississippi. Okay, it's poor. Like Europe is poor. It's only rich on paper, but we have been financing and supporting this sort of illusion that Europe is still the dominant global force, and all the global institutions are basically their proxy. And we've been financing all of this and pushing this sort of culture. But the point is that liberal society has a critical weakness that is exploited. And no liberal society has course corrected. And so everywhere you drop this liberal egalitarian, democracy, everywhere you drop it, society starts to die, with one exception, just because it's small and hasn't gotten there yet. And that's Botswana, who's on a tear because that country's crushing it. But there's only 3 million people there, and it's located someplace, where nobody's paying attention. But it doesn't matter what race the people are. It doesn't matter what religion they are. It doesn't matter anything. You drop they all become susceptible to the same things, which is why liberal leftism is universal, but rightism, whatever the right politics, are nationalistic. So the political right is different in every country, but the left is universal because the left is predicated on the exploit of liberalism. So if you spread liberalism, everywhere has the same vulnerability. And this is a problem geopolitically that nobody really wants to come to terms with, because here's an idea. Maybe the most important thing is not democracy. And this is like a jarring concept. Maybe if you're Panama, you might say, it's more important that I build a healthy culture than a democracy. In America, for example, we wanted to be a free country, which meant we had to be a morally virtuous country. Was more important than being a democracy because we started as a republic. But would it be better for America to have a king if the result of that king made us more virtuous and more free? Well, from a cultural perspective, from an American perspective, that's the better answer. That's correct. We should do that if it resulted, because moral virtue necessary to live free is our fundamental cultural heritage. That's what it is to be an American. Democracy is not important to being an American. Now, I am not in favor of us having a king, partly because I don't think that's a result. But if it did produce that result, it would be the better outcome. Well, does anybody think that global egalitarian liberal democracy has benefited Japan? Sure, you get an economic boost from it, and then your society dies. Your thousands of years old society dies almost instantly from a long perspective. Does anybody think
South Korea?
Yeah, South Korea is dying even faster. Do you think they benefited from this form liberal, global, liberal egalitarian democracy? Has France benefited from it? Has Argentina who has exactly benefited from this? Now, I'm not going to sit there and posit what should be the ideal form of government. Maybe Japan should be run by the emperor again. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But what I can tell you is that it's increasingly doesn't look like either there isn't a solution to the critical theory exploit. There isn't, that vulnerability to liberalism may be insurmountable. I don't know. But if I'm a country in the sort of Anglosphere, I might be wedded to it because of its cultural legacy, maybe. But the idea that we're absolutely committed to this form of government as the end of history, this is the end-all be-all government. There will never be a new form of government. Well, I got to tell you, from a historical perspective, Spain should probably have a king. Portugal should probably have a king, right? Germany should probably have a king. Why? We bring Prussia back. Why not? Maybe not Prussia, right? But
not Prussia,
right? Japan should probably have an emperor who has real governing power. Britain should probably have an authority. Queen Elizabeth was terrible because she had more power and is still technically there, but she allowed herself to be relegated to a mascot. So now any future monarch who tries to assert the power will basically be laughed out of, just be laughed at, and that'll be the end of the monarchy. Because she allowed herself to be a mascot. And I know the English love her, but they're garbage people, and I don't care what they think. The reality is that Islam's growth is, Islam isn't really well suited to things like democracy. It's not. Like, it just isn't. And it has a lot of sort of effectively non-democratic rulers. And because their form of government, like Saudi Arabia is a kingdom, better reflects the culture of Islam, which results in the culture being more dynamic.
They're cutting with the grain.
Right. Yeah. Saudi Arabia is a healthier culture because its people and its religion and its politics align in a way to make the culture dynamic. If you're Argentina, what's better for you? Being a democracy or being the most Argentinian that you can be? So that's a really critical question. If you're, pick a country. If you're France, do you want to be the most French you can be, or do you want to be a democracy? If you're Japan, do you want to be the most Japanese you can be, or do you want to be a democracy? The liberal egalitarian democracy increasingly looks, and if you'd asked me this when I was 20, I was a libertarian when I was 20. We're all stupid at some point in our life.
Everyone has to be a libertarian.
Right. Well, but, libertarian, one of the big problems is that it cuts out the entire moral component, tries to reduce everything down to natural rights, which is not viable for a culture. But the idea here is that if you look at these cultures, this form of government does not appear to have done them any favors. They're all dying, all of them. Even the total fertility rate in Mexico is well below replacement and has been for at least a decade. It's below replacement in India, right? It's like this, yes, it makes you richer. And it might be the wealth and not the, it might be the wealth. I don't know for sure. There's reason to think it could be both, but there's definitely a good reason to think that the egalitarian liberalism is not a good universal fit. And the attempt to universalize it has proven catastrophic.
Yeah, this is a funny thing about even the recent H-1B debates online is a lot of people in the tech right, they're if you reduce the argument in some of these cases, I'm not even reducing it, it's explicitly what they're saying, is like, all the other stuff aside, culture, heritage, all this stuff is frivolous, irrelevant, doesn't matter. GDP is what matters,
right.
Like line go up, number go up, like China's here, we're here. All of these things, family, culture, language.
But all of the evidence.
Dissolvable, useless.
What's insane about this is the kind of person who advocates for that is the kind of person who loves to also claim to be super scientific and rational, when all of the empirical evidence suggests that the only result of that is death. You get rich and then you die. That is the clear trajectory of every single civilization on the planet that has attempted this. And at some point you have to say, maybe they should do something else. Maybe they should do something that's a little bit better aligned. And whatever you think of Islam, and I'm not famously fond of it, it is unapologetic about this. They're like, we have the right way to live, and this is how we're going to live, and we don't care what you, and the Ayatollah was actually of Iran was actually quite acutely aware of this. He understood that the modern sort of liberal political order, the egalitarian, was a threat to religious life. And the West still had a simulacrum of religion, although we basically, I don't think most Americans or most Christians are Christian. I think they're liberals. I don't mean liberals in the political sense. I mean they've adopted this kind of utopian liberalism as their default religion, and it's just wearing Christian clothing. The Ayatollah recognized this. He understood this, and he understood that this was a massive threat to Islam. And so they actively rejected a lot of the trappings of this. And again, whatever you think of the Ayatollah, in many respects, he was a better steward of his people than our leaders have been. And that's a horrible thing to say. Right? And you can go back to the Hitler point. Whatever you think of Hitler, and yes, he would have wanted peace. No, he wouldn't have. Okay. He talked about it for a long time. He did not want peace, right? He didn't want to lose the war, but he didn't want peace, but misguided as he was and deeply flawed, he was in some senses a better steward or at least he wanted to be a better steward. He was not, because again, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting of it,
Right.
and the destruction of your country means you failed. So you're not, you were not. Sorry, buddy.
To today are like some of the most emasculated folks, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Like marvel of might in the previous years. Now it's like permits for this. You can't say that. They're arrested for Facebook.
Aggressively compliant, right? It's like, sorry, Hitler, you destroyed your culture. You're not getting reformed. Not on my watch. Like you know. But it's weird to say this. But now it's worth pointing out that Iran also has a declining birth rates below replacement. I think it's among the lowest in the Islamic world, if not the lowest. But they have other issues because the culture he was a steward of was not actually authentic to that region. This is the Persian people are not fundamentally Muslim in the same way that he wanted to. So there was a disconnect there, which is still poisoning that region. But if you assume that Iran was culturally aligned with his vision of Islam, then he would have been a better steward. So he was at least attempting, in the same way Hitler was, I guess, acting as an attempt to be a better steward of his culture. And it is there's some hope. And again, but this is why Islam is taking over, because again, the Islamic cultures are still dynamic. Like you look at warfare today. The most effective military conquests are not going to be by armies, because it doesn't matter how powerful your weaponry is. If 100,000 people walk across our border, we're not going to shoot them. We're not going to drop a nuclear bomb. We're not going to run them over with tanks. So what value is our powerful military if we can't even use it? So the most powerful nations on earth increasingly are not the ones with the most money or the most weaponry. They're the ones that have tens or hundreds of millions of people they can drop on your border, which means Nigeria and India and China, although China's got huge demographic problems, are actually more powerful because they can just drop millions of people on your GDP-obsessed culture can't live anymore. It has nothing. All of its soul's been ripped out. It's nothing but GDP now, which means it can't function without people. And so what's happening is the people who have people can just drop them on your border, and you can't say no. You're like an alcoholic. Like there's no way to say no because that's your blood. You need it, or at least you think you need it to live. And so the Islamic cultures, for all the things they've done wrong, have produced a lot of people. And they can drop those people off on your doorstep. And now you have a geopolitical situation where, correctly, I believe Trump is correct in this, in effectively identifying that we cannot be engaging in a proxy war with Russia because they're a nuclear power and we're a nuclear power. And two nuclear powers get into a tit for tat, the risk of escalation is too great. It's far better for Ukraine to lose a few miles of territory, a few hundreds of miles of territory. Like that's better. And so Europe wants to say, oh, well, we'll do it. We'll rally. Okay. Well, here's the problem with Europe right now. You're too old, too weak. You can't wage war. So what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to train a bunch of immigrants to do it for you. So now you're going to train a bunch of Muslims and African immigrants. And you know what they're not going to want to do? Go into a meat grinder war with Russia.
They have your country.
Yeah.
That's not theirs.
Right. They're not stupid. They're not going to do that. So they're going to be forced to make a decision. Do we either leave, fight this stupid war for no reason, or just overthrow this weak, decrepit old government? I think the most likely outcome, if Europe pursues the path of conquer, Russia's in no position to conquer Europe. That's nonsense. But I think Europe might collapse simply by attempting to rally an army to do that. They may very well train their own invaders and conquerors. And you see it in a place like Ireland where they're like bringing in, illegals and they're settling them and then they're training them to be police and they're also dropping the requirements for them to do it. They're importing, and eventually they'll just say, okay, well, now I don't need, why do we have to listen to you anymore? So I think the odds of Europe doing that are fairly high. And it might be necessary. Hopefully they come to their senses, but it might be necessary. But that is, again, it's the same issue. It's like you chase GDP endlessly as the only thing. All evidence suggests that kills any culture you're in. that is not enough for a culture to survive, which means you're just burning through something. Like you're going to run out of this consumable resource of healthy cultures that you can actually make GDP in. This is very short-sighted thinking. It's very poor thinking. And the West is absolutely absurd. And also countries like Japan are absurd in doing this, which is inviting in people who think of your country as not something to be cherished, but something to be consumed or extracted from. And this is exactly what they're doing, and it's ludicrous. But yeah, I mean, again, I don't know the political solution. I think it differs from country to country. But if you look at people accuse, Bukele in El Salvador of being, a dictator, well, he's not, but they might be better off if he was, because he seems to be a responsible steward of his culture. Now, maybe he gets tempted into vice. You never know. But he appears he looks to be a guy who could be a legitimate monarch. He wants what's best for his people. He wants his people to improve. He wants to protect them. He has done more for the people of El Salvador than any other human being on this earth. If that's not a king, who is? Like, if you're not going to trust that guy, you're going to trust the next guy who replaces him? Good
better,
Lord.
Or to be better or something like that.
What are the odds? If that guy was in charge of El Salvador for 40 years, what will El Salvador be? It would probably be a significantly greater country. Does anybody think that democracy can provide that level of stewardship?
Thanks, Bukele. You're amazing, but 40 years later, you got to go, man.
Right. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's what they should do. That's for them to decide, but it's a question that we should be able to seriously...
Right. The heuristic says you can't even ask that.
Right.
Ask that is just bad.
And we have to start asking this question and saying, maybe we really should be looking at stepping back from pushing democracy overall, because this is just Wilsonianism. Like, who's Wilson? Make the world safe for democracy. Why? We're not even a democracy. We were a republic, or at least we were.
Well, no, as you see with all the Doge stuff, like we were
right.
Yeah, that democracy. Come on.
Right, but this is the insanity of it. Like, we have for an entire century now, a little more than a century, we have been pushing this idea that democracy is the most important thing everywhere in the world. As Obama said, freedom is a human universal. First of all, it clearly isn't. Obviously isn't. China is perfectly happy to not be a free country, right? Does anybody think that Xi in China is the worst dictator? Like, is he a dictator? Yes. Does anybody think he's bad for China, given the alternatives? Listen, China has a long history of failure. They're the most underperforming society in human history. They should have dominated the globe. They made every mistake you can imagine. And to be in the position that they were in like 1970, just an absolute backwater garbage nation. And look what they've done. Yeah, not all of it's great, but if you're Chinese, what they've done is like, you much rather like China. At least they've done something that they can be proud of. They have improved. They have lots of problems still, and the demographic problems will be critical. But for the average Chinese person, the civilization that they live in is significantly better than it was. And it's looking up, or at least it is from their perspective. It's a confident, assertive nation. It's getting wealthier. It's developing in many areas, and it may suffer a calamitous fall, but from current position, it looks pretty good. Does the fact that she's a dictator matter? Why? Here, China, we'd like you to be a democracy, but your ancient civilization will also die as a result. It's basically the HIV of politics. This is a terrible offer, and we're just spreading around the globe like some degenerate creep who refuses to use a condom. Right? This is what we're doing.
So what's the antidote to the spread of liberalism?
I think at least contending with the problem that maybe I still think that, certainly within the Anglosphere and then the United States, we should there's a lot of this is tied to us very deeply in our culture that we need to be very careful, but we need to spend more effort trying to figure out how to shore up the actual exploit, the vulnerability. We need to figure this out. This is a deep philosophical and moral problem. We have to figure out how to close that exploit, because if we don't, it will be fatal. But we should also abandon our democracy fetish and just say to
alternatives.
And just say to the rest of the world, listen, you do what is right for your culture, and we recognize that will return us to an earlier stage in human development, or geopolitics, I should say, where countries are maybe a little bit more playing a Game of Thrones type of thing. We're going to have a little bit more of an antagonistic, less friendly dynamic, but we're willing to do that if the health of the world improves as a result. And you should put in power the people who you think will steward your cultures to their best. And we won't send the CIA in there and a bunch of nonprofits to mess with your culture to make you into a democracy so that we can, whatever, trans your kids or something, right? Like, maybe we should try that and just say, let's just pull back and let you guys do what you do. And maybe we'll have a problem. Maybe we'll end up dealing with a powerful dictatorship that's just crazy successful, and we're like, crap, they're whooping us. And you know what? Maybe we don't want to go that route, so we'll just have to figure out how to beat them the way we know how to beat them. We'll play our game.
Yeah, there's something clean about that.
We'll
to just say, well, that guy's an actual threat, not just all these sort of bureaucratic
if we want to
layers of NGOs and nonprofits and CIA and USAID.
We'll be the free society, and we'll compete with the dictatorship. But if they want to be a dictatorship or a monarchy or whatever it is, we just need to remove. Like, after World War I, the America pays a lot of this because Wilson hated the monarchies. It's been a huge pride point in the way we talk about World War I that it ended the monarchies. But honestly, has Europe benefited from that? Has their artistic or cultural output or their health and vigor, have those improved with the decline of the monarchy? No. All that's happened is they're now on the verge of death instead of the verge of world domination. It's hard to see that as a success unless you're an absolute idiot. So let's just start there and say, let's talk about this. And I think in a very dim-witted way, this is what the kind of like guys who are trying a little bit of reform Nazism are actually trying to do. They're trying to say not being a liberal democracy is not the worst thing. I think they're doing it in arguably the dumbest possible way it could be done. Oh, sure, we'll pick the worst example. Awesome.
Yeah.
Just punch me in the balls right now.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to wrap.
Great wrap. Yeah.
For this time.
And on that note.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.